All right, we're now starting our fourth section in our lecture on imperialism, and this is focused on the question of how was Europe able to colonize most of the world. So we'll be looking at this first question in this section and the second question in the next lecture. And that is a question of European justification. So what was it telling itself to make it seem moral? So these are three separate questions, and without answers to all of them, there would be no European colonization of Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. So we need to be able to answer each. How were they physically able to colonize? And then motivation. Why would they want to colonize? And then third, how did they justify that it was moral to take over other people? So a question of ability, motivation, and justification. And when we look at independence movements, we'll find that the desire for freedom came in response to these European actions. This lecture is focusing just on ability. The most obvious is of technology, and we'll see that these technological cases that we see at right can be disaggregated or sorted into a few different kinds of technology. Our first is technology that shrinks time and space. I know that sounds kind of wacky or sci-fi or whatever, talking about compression of time and space, but really that's an important way of thinking about it, or a useful way of thinking about it. So think of it this way. If you were in Amsterdam or The Hague in the Netherlands in 1600, around the time of the Dutch East India Company, and you were wanting to send a message to what was known as the Spice Islands, that was controlled by the Netherlands, today Indonesia, and you were to get that message to there and then back, how long would it take? So pause this, go look at a map, and make a guess. How long do you think it would take? Well, if you guessed around 3 or 4 years, you'd be right. And the reason for that is at this time, you would need to go in your message would need to go all the way along the Atlantic coast of Africa, across or down through the Cape of Good Hope. If you made it, because this is very, very tricky water at the Cape of Good Hope, lots of boats sink there, but say you make it, and then you have to cross the Indian Ocean, and then you have to get to Indonesia, and then you have to go inland. And right, there's no interstate highway system. It's slow going in through the hills and the mountains. And then you come back with the message, and you have to wait for the trade winds to be blowing in the right direction, because again, you're traveling by sail. And so that may delay you some months. And then the trip back. So if you were to do it, best case scenario, 3 years. We fast forward a few hundred years following the Industrial Revolution, and you have steam power that accelerates how fast you can go and opens up the ability to go against the trade winds. When we bring in things like the canal, like the Suez Canal, instead of having to travel along the Atlantic coast of West Africa and all the way to South Africa and the Cape of Good Hope, you can just go through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal in 1869, 67, something like that. And boom, you're in the Indian Ocean. This makes things go a lot faster. We can accelerate that further with telegraphs that allow messages to be traveled at great distance nearly instantaneously. And we look today at cell phones. You're able to scroll through social media on your phone and chuckle at a meme made by a kid in some other part of the world. Now imagine if that kid had to travel to you, that young person had to travel to you to tell you a joke. This changes things dramatically. Technology shrinks time and space. If you are laughing at a joke made by someone else in Beaverton, it's like you're sitting in your room and that other person is in there with you telling you that joke. That space of being across town or across the US or across the world is negligible. That person is there with you instantaneously. Military technology. This is a broader category than what we have in the image here, but let's just focus at the image at first. So in the 1860s, around the time of the American Civil War, the most advanced rifle technology is breech loading. But if you've ever seen a Civil War movie or documentary, you know that most of it is muzzle loading. So you put all the ball and the wadding and the gunpowder down the tube, and then you ram it with a rod, and then you fire it. It's a slow process. It takes a long time to fire a bullet. And then there's the risk of you not actually shooting it, and then it's so loud in the battle that you put another ball and wadding, and pretty soon your whole thing is full of bullets. Wow. So these were not the effective, efficient murder weapons that they are down here. So you go from 1860, where breech loading, breeches from the backside like this, the most advanced technology, to 20 years later with the Maxim gun by Hiram Maxim, Maxim, was allowed firing at 11 bullets a second. This and other technologies like steam-powered gunships that could attack inland targets gave Europeans a huge military advantage. Machine guns, repeating rifles, exploding shells all made European armies more lethal than they were even 20, 30 years earlier. And it's certainly true that African and Asian leaders who had the economic means were able to purchase military technologies from neighboring European states, but those were the exceptions rather than the rules. I'll give you an example of what this mismatch looked like. So prior to this advancement, in the 1830s in Algeria, the French fight Abdelkader in Algeria, and you'll hear that name again when we come to Algeria. And when they fight, they have nearly equal munitions, and the battle is not lopsided. But if we looked at 1898 in Sudan, in East Africa, in the Battle of Omdurman, the British killed 10,800 Sudanese, and the British only lost 49. 10,800 Sudanese to 49. This imbalance is a reason for European ability to imperialize. Our third form of technology is medical technology. Africa was known as the white man's grave. I'm doing air quotes, the white man's grave. In fact, in the early 19th century, malaria killed half of all Europeans who reached West Africa within a year. If you remember that slide, let me see if I can bring it up here real fast. This map, the reason for this map is malaria. One of the reasons. If we look at all of these possessions, all of these holdings along the coast, they are on the coast because movement into the interior would lead to a high mortality rate for Europeans. Now, this is malaria is principally it's a problem across the tropics. I got malaria once in India. It's really, really awful. And it was awful for me, and we had the technology to deal with malaria, of course. But in this part of the world, in Asia, it's the bigger dilemma facing Europeans is gastrointestinal diseases. Those were more serious. In West Africa, it's malaria. But again, malaria is throughout the tropics. So what happens in the mid 1800s is you have the use of quinine, the discovery of quinine by Europeans. It was already discovered by non-Europeans. And then also around 1900, 1914, the discovery of the mosquito as the vector for malaria, and improvements in germ theory. So all of these medical technologies allowed for movement into the interior. You could have all the steamships you wanted, all the railroads you wanted, all the guns you wanted, but if you're going to be killed off by malaria, you're not going to go into the interior. You're not going to colonize in the interior. Our next case, or next cause, I should say, is looking at who the Europeans were contesting. And as it just so happens, around the same time, around the 1700s, these great powers that were so dominant in the 1500s and 1600s, all more or less around the same time, began to weaken. So I'll give you a metaphor. Some of you maybe play sports for Southridge. Now, your team may be getting better, but if the really good club, and I don't know who that is, let's say Jesuit, their seniors are half their team last year, and now this year they're mostly freshmen, you're going to probably do better by no fault of your own, by no improvement of your own, just because they have gotten weaker. And we see this dynamic happening here in the 1700s. The Mughal Empire in India, after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, really took a deep decline. In fact, was declining during the last years of Aurangzeb in the late 1600s. The Ottoman Empire also lost a lot of its strength and had a weak grasp of its North African provinces throughout the 1700s. And when we look at Algeria later on, we'll see how the Ottoman weakness allowed for the French to come in. The French came into Algeria not fighting against the Ottomans. They came in as the Ottomans were retreating, as they were weakened. Same thing if we come over here to Qing China. The Qing dynasty was facing rebellions, and by the late 1700s, European armies faced limited resistance as they claimed new territories. If we accelerate into the 1850s, we see the Opium Wars really devastate the Qing Empire, leading to its eventual collapse. So what I'd like to ask you to do is review your list. We looked at weakening global empires. We looked at medical technology. We looked at military technology. And we looked at technology that shrinks time and space. So review your list. Note what you think were the most significant and why. Take some time not just to make that list, but to evaluate that list. Insert your own analysis and opinion in your notes. If you can pause this film at this point and do that, that'd be great. All right, so now that you've gotten a chance to write and analyze, it's important to go beyond sort of facile views that, oh, Europe had the best technology, Europe was so strong, Europe had so much cool stuff that of course they were going to take over the world. That's too simplistic. It's not enough just to have the technology to take over, to have the ability to take over. But you need to have a moral justification and a desire to explain why you should take over. And the simple fact is, if it was just ability to take over the world, it would not have been the British and the French. It would have been the Chinese. If you were a betting person, at basically any point in the last 3,000 years, if you were going to say who you thought would be a global dominant power in 1900, basically at any point in the last 3,000 years, you would be wise to put your money on the Chinese. Because for most of the last 3,000 years, the Chinese have had overwhelming military superiority, overwhelming technological superiority, far greater than anything out of Europe over the last 3,000 years, greater than the Ottomans, Indians. It was impressive. The ships the image that you have here are the voyages of Zheng He. Zheng He spelled Zheng space He. Zheng space He. Zheng He. And so Zheng He was an admiral, and he led what was called the treasure fleet. This was 7 voyages of the treasure fleet from 1405 to 1433. Now I bring this up not because you need to write down about Zheng He and the treasure fleet. I just want you to take this in. Zheng He, who led this armada of ships, 317 ships, all at sea in a group together. 28,000 sailors on these 317 ships at sea together, going from place to place together. And this was 70 years before Columbus. This was the largest navy in the world for a 500-year period, and it wasn't until World War I that the world saw a bigger navy. This little silhouette here is Columbus's ship. Shoot, 1 second. This is the size of the Nina Pinta and Santa Maria. And this is one of the treasure ships of Zheng He. And yes, this was the largest of the ships, but even the ships that carried water, and there were many, many, many ships that just carried fresh water, those were bigger than this silhouette you see here. So the Chinese had vast, overwhelming technological superiority. And if they wanted to, they certainly could have conquered vast spaces, as they again had the technological superiority. And if you think I'm just talking about the Navy, I'm not. Take a moment to look through this list. We're talking about steel. 1,000 years ago, China was producing considerably more steel than Britain produced in the 1780s. They were innovators in textile manufacturing, so textiles, clothes, 7 centuries before the British textile revolution that we looked at in the previous slides. This voyage was not a military conquest, but it was basically a trade and soft power. It was basically to travel from place to place and impress upon them, hey, aren't we awesome? Yeah, we're awesome. Don't forget it. So, in addition to trade, we also have China's agricultural superiority and productivity that vastly superseded anything that the West had, all the way from 3,000 years ago to the 18th century. As you probably know, it was central in paper and firearms and gunpowder and so many tools, and it had the world's most advanced navigational system. All of this is explored in the West by a guy named Joseph Needham, Needham. And the Needham question is, if they were so technologically superior, why didn't they take over the world? And this is sort of a cultural question rather than a technological question. But it raises for us this issue that it's not enough just to have the ability to take over. But you need to want to take over, and then the moral justification to explain why you should take over. It is clear through this lecture that Europe had vast technological superiority through military, medical, transportation, and it had the good luck of weakening global empires. So yeah, it had the ability to take over. But the Chinese had the ability to take over too. India during the Mughal Empire had 22% of the world's GDP. It had the ability to take over, but it did not want to, and did not have a story that it told itself of doing this, doing imperializing the world, is moral. And this is one of the key pieces that we'll pick up next time as we look at European narratives, stories that Europeans told itself of why they would, why they needed to, and why it would be moral to do that. So we'll pick up next video looking at motivations and justifications. All right, thanks for listening.